welcome to the press availability for the Alaska Independent Democratic Coalition. I'm the coalition leader, Representative Chris Tuck. Joined today, I have two members from our Resources Committee, Representative Geran Tarr, representing Russian Jack, Mountain View, and Airport Heights, and then Representative Josephson, representing East Anchorage into Midtown. Visiting this week, we have Alaska Municipal League. They're having their annual legislative conference, and it continues until tomorrow. Tarr is here, the Cabaret Hotel, Restaurant, and Retailers Association. Alaska PTA, they're holding their fly-in, which starts today and goes through Thursday. And then United Fishermen of Alaska is having their semi-annual springboard meeting starting tomorrow and going to the 20th. Coming up, we have a joint legislative session with our Honorable Senator Lisa Murkowski. She's going to be doing her annual address to the legislature. And this morning at 10 a.m., the House Fisheries Committee will receive a presentation on Alaska Maritime Workforce Development Plan. And today, House Finance Committee is hearing presentations on oil and gas production tax credits and the AKLNG project. The 13-member Alaska Independent Democratic Coalition are hard at work in committee and on the floor with the goal of protecting the interests of the people of Alaska. We're in favor of legislation and policies that support those who are trying to earn a living wage and provide for their families. We are committed to holding the line on public education. Studies shows that the best way to improve economic standing is through education, and we can't jeopardize the ability for students and families to move up the economic ladder just because the price of oil has proven to be more volatile than forecasted. Good jobs require good education. Good education creates good jobs. There's a lot of rhetoric and, quite frankly, some bad ideas that are floating around. We got to make sure that when responding to the current fiscal situation, that we don't do uninformed knee-jerk reactions that potentially can have a negatively impact our Alaska's economy. We must examine and come to a consensus about how and where to cut spending, but one thing that's clear is that we will not sacrifice our priorities, and that is to protect public education, have safer communities, have affordable and accessible health care and opportunities for Alaskans. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Representative Josephson.
Thank you, Representative Tuck. Just as an introduction, there are just a few issues I want to touch on today. The first issue is Medicaid expansion. That is, of course, front and center this session. It's something I have great passion for. I filed a resolution in 2013 and a bill in 2014. We know that, and repeated studies have shown, that we could employ 4,000 people in important healthcare positions. They would bring in about $1 billion in income and wages, and the ripple effect of that whole activity would be about $2.4 billion. We also know that from a study just about 10 days ago, the Evergreen study, that the state would save $6.1 million. It would save that money that it otherwise would spend from the general fund by using Medicaid expansion to cover chronic care needs and other needs of our corrections inmates. I believe that the governor's got this right, and by that what I mean is that we don't need legislation other than an operating budget that includes receipt of that line item. And there's been some discussion of the need for a bill. It can be done that way. It was positioned that way last year, frankly, to force the hand of Governor Parnell, who was opposed to Medicaid expansion. But if there's a call for legislation, I have a solution, and that is let's have the hearings. Again, I don't think it's necessary. Another issue that's been front and center for me has been the Exxon Valdez bill that I filed, which looks at reopening. It's called the reopener provision. The question of remediation. This was something that we agreed to by contract with Exxon in the 1991 settlement. We broached them in 2006 and said, what do you make of it? They didn't respond. Meanwhile, the federal court, and I have those pleadings upstairs, has said, state and federal government, why aren't you pushing this matter more? Either, fish or cut bait, if you will. And so the legislature did this in 2006 by resolution. It needs to do it again. We need to have a dialogue about this. There is need for further remediation. The final issue, and one related to the Exxon Valdez question, has been subcommittee activity. In the Department of Environmental Conservation, for example, there's been an intensive look at the Spill Prevention and Response Fund, which is now inadequate and underfunded. I met with the Regional Citizens Advisory Council of Prince William Sound. They're direly worried about that as well. So we're looking at reform of that. Meanwhile, in DNR, we're seeing some changes in their operating budget, primarily by backing off what I think are some needless expenses on ANCSA, or rather ANILCA enforcement and federal access issues, and instead putting positions into Ms. Rutherford's budget so that we can advance the gas line. Relative to the university, that's a long subject, but I'm a staunch supporter of the university, but there's been concern that I've raised that there are too many administrators, too many executives, that it's top-heavy, and that the university for decades now has been trying to do too much for too many. It's laudable, but it's become a problem. And so with that, I'll turn this back to Representative Tuck.
Thank you, Representative Josephson, and also serving on resources with us is Representative Geran Tarr.
Good morning, Representative Geran Tarr from Airport Heights, Russian Jack, and Mountain View. It's good to see everybody this morning. Have two topics I'm going to talk about. One will come as no surprise, Aaron's Law, and the second is an update from the House Resources Committee. On Aaron's Law, many of you were able to meet our guest, Alaskan David Holthouse, who was with us last week, to share his compelling personal story in support of Aaron's Law. He shared a couple of important reasons why he supports Aaron's Law. He was raped when he was 7 years old, and he believes that a couple of things might have happened if a law like this were in place. One, that the individual who committed this act might not have done it at all, because had they known that students were being educated on speaking up, they might not have thought that they could force him to keep that secret. That's often how they control these young children, these vulnerable children, is by forcing them to keep it a secret. And a second is that he wouldn't have kept it a secret so long. He would have been empowered to speak up. He talks about how the worst part of his experience was suffering alone and that lonely feeling in that silence. So we're just moved by his testimony. Thank him again for taking the time to come here on such an important issue. We're disappointed we haven't seen a hearing in the House, and we'll keep working for that. But we're pleased to have a hearing on a Senate version of the bill last week. Had a lot of important testimony from supporters around the state. Heard some concerns. We are ready to work on those concerns, work with our community partners. We think this is something that has to happen this year. We support the governor and his call to send a bill to his desk as soon as possible. On the Resources Committee, want to provide an update from our coalition's perspective. There was a timeline released from the Senate majority yesterday at their morning press availability. It's an ambitious timeline. We are as committed as anyone in this building to making a gas line a reality. And I joke that it was my second master's degree for the number of hours that I put in on Senate Bill 138 last year. But there are some things that we want to be careful about. And in fact, it's Representative Mike Hawker who has passed out a book to all members of the legislature about mega projects. And one thing they warn against is making there be an arbitrary timeline that forces you to action. So our position is that we have to get the best deal for Alaska. We have to make sure it's the right long-term deal. It has that durability for Alaskans. And we're anxious to hear from the third floor about replacements for the AGDC board. We support the governor in his position of looking for the right Alaskans to fill those positions. We were supportive of the move, and we're looking forward to those qualified individuals taking those positions. There are a couple important pieces of legislation that need to be introduced. I know Representative Josephson and I stand ready to work those extra hours, and I'm well conditioned for it after the last couple years of multiple meetings and weekend meetings. So we're ready. We're going to work as hard as possible. We know that we need that. It's our economic future. It's our clean energy future. But we're not going to make an arbitrary timeline force us into a deal that isn't the best deal for Alaskans. Thank you.
And with that, we'll open it up to questions.
I have one. I'm Nat Hers from Alaska Dispatch News. I have one for Representative Josephson. You mentioned the oil spill response and prevention fund. You said it needs reform. Just curious if you have specific ideas about what's the most appropriate way to bring revenues back up to where they need to be to match with expenses.
Sure. You know, Nat, I always wish that I could be the person who came up with every great idea, but this is never going to happen. And Representative Seaton of Homer has a great idea. His idea would be, first of all, to say that there will always be 5 cents per barrel collected. Even if the larger account, the $50 million account, is at $50 million, those cents per barrel will still come in. Secondly, he would tax other refined fuels because they're also contributors to spills. It's not just taps. We know that DEC responds to over 2,000 large, some smaller than others, but large enough to respond to spills per year. So I look at Representative Seaton, and he has some sway, I think, in this building, and I think I would support his bill.
Any questions?
Rhonda McBride, KTVA. So, tomorrow I think is day 30 of the sessions, a third of the way through. What do you think we have accomplished at this 1/3 milestone?
Well, that's a very good question. Things do seem to be kind of a little bit of a holding pattern. And I think that's because we're in a unique situation that we haven't seen in many, many years. And of course, that's the budget deficits that we're faced. Trying to prioritize what projects that we want to see go forward, trying to figure out how best to make these cuts, because I think everyone's concerned. We do not want to tank the economy. We don't want to take an axe to the budget. We're going to have to delicately fine-tune things, find efficiencies, combined activities. And so in doing all of that, I think what has been going on is a dialogue. And I think that dialogue is going to continue. I think there's going to be a lot more focus on the budget subcommittees than we've seen in the past. I think there's going to be a lot more discussions and a lot of exercises to take place in that.
No more comments on the 1/3 mark?
I'll say something about it. You know, Rhonda, it is remarkable how little has happened, but how incredibly busy I feel, and I think I can speak for my colleagues that they feel that way too. It is remarkably busy. But yes, if the football were on the 50-yard line, it hasn't really moved in either direction a whole lot. But I do think the 60 of us are working hard, and the clock will force us along, as it always does. I think that, I think that the standing committees could hear more legislation than they're hearing. And I would encourage their chairman to utilize the full 2 hours of a hearing. Of course, that's at their discretion. I think that we're all sort of trying to find the sweet spot on cutting departmental budgets. And we don't want it too far one way or the other. But there's been some consensus, too, that the capital budgets have been too large, that we have to do some cutting, there's that we have to move the gas line along because it's our life raft. It is out there in 2025 and would go a long way to letting Alaskans continue to enjoy the lifestyles they're used to.
Yes.
Nat Hers with Alaska Dispatch News again. I just have a really simple question. I mean, do the governor's cuts in the operating budget, do they go far enough?
Well, do they go far enough? I don't think you can ever go far enough with the budget deficit that we're facing right now, but you definitely can go too far. And I know you look confused about that, but again, we don't want to jeopardize the economic future of Alaska. If we were to terminate every state employee, that saves you $1 billion to $1.4 billion. That does not take us down, take that $3.5 billion deficit down enough. So we just got to be careful that we still provide lasting opportunities for Alaskans. We continue a commitment to education, and we keep services that are vital to our communities.
I guess, do you feel like his budget accomplishes that?
I think it's a start. I think that's not going to be the final budget as we go through this committee process. And so yeah, we'll see how things shape. Representative Tarr?
Well, let me just give an example of what's going on that is positive, I think, in the budget process. It's encouraging collaboration between departments in ways that may not have happened before, and having some new conversations. So a good example of that would be the Department of Corrections is proposing to shut down community jails, right? That's a high impact action. That means that the Department of Public Safety would have additional prisoner transport responsibilities. Now the departments are talking to each other, sort of figuring out, well, is that actually a cost saver if you're just cost shifting to another department? And perhaps it will help us, think of things like additional video teleconferencing opportunities, or realigning schedules, or putting additional public defender resources in certain areas. So those kind of conversations are taking place, and I think that those are more thoughtful in nature. It has been in the last couple of years that the budget work, a lot of it had been done when the budget got to the legislature, and it didn't look vastly different from the one that came out of the third floor. This is very much a work in progress, and getting those important details is taking a little more time.
Josephson?
Well, I guess I would add just the following, that there are times, and you can see this in subcommittee, where there isn't any wiggle room. So, for example, a department I'm familiar with, because I was employed there, the Department of Law, if you have X number of prosecutors and they're working 10 hours a day, and they must have one investigator and one staff, they can't function with any less. And we see that. But I think, to take Representative Tuck's point, we don't necessarily see it in every division and in every section. And I think there are some areas, like the Department of Commerce, where the goals of a division are aspirational. So, for example, a conference is attended in Toronto or Brussels with the hope that there's some sort of return. And we need to make sure that we measure that return and that we're getting the results that have been noted. It's much clearer when you're talking about children in need of aid or child support collection or law enforcement, that you see the correlation. And I think that's part of what we're talking about, too.
Rhonda McBride, KTVA. Since the Municipal League is here in town, what are your thoughts on the budget, on how municipalities are faring, particularly rural ones? And you brought up the jail, the community jail. I've heard from a lot that this is, they don't know what they're going to do, and they're going to have dangerous people to deal with that won't have a place.
Well, communities are going to be impacted by the deficit that we see here in the state of Alaska. I mean, that's all Alaskans are going to be impacted. We're just trying to minimize the impacts and make sure that we get the greatest return that we can. And so with the Alaska Municipal League here, we're hearing, of course, one of the things that's very important to them is municipal revenue sharing. And that's been the state's promise to share the oil wealth with local communities. Unfortunately, this year we don't see a whole lot of oil wealth coming into the state, especially with us paying out. So I think there's a $22 million cut in municipal revenue sharing, and they're here to try to keep their services going. That's vital for their communities as well.
Yeah, one thing I would add to that is, when the subject of termination costs, which is a very complicated subject, and I don't pretend to be an expert on it, but when that came up, particularly last year, I was fairly defensive of public sector workers, and part of that defensiveness came from the mayor of Anchorage. Well, it didn't come from him, it came through him to me. And I believe with some cause that because of the contentious Administrative Order 37, that I was worried that this was going to be used as an effort to privatize sections of our good public workers who can serve us more directly and more noticeably in the public sector. But now that that issue has sort of settled, I think termination costs, it's what I hear constantly from municipal officials, is something that we perhaps should take a look at.
Just one follow-up question on something you said, Representative Tarr. Why is it that Aaron's bill isn't getting any hearings in the House side of the equation? I mean, last year lawmakers said, oh my God, we forgot this bill. So if they're really that sorry about it, why aren't they giving that bill a hearing?
I don't have a good answer for that. We've put in a committee hearing request, and I can tell you who the committee chair is, and you could follow up with his office. I know that there's a lot of interest in the legislation. I know they've had some other bills and overviews. A lot of the committees have been busy with the overviews and getting that sort of foundational information for new members. My hope would be that we'd see it scheduled very soon.
I mean, what reasons have you been given when you've made your request as to why it can't be heard?
It's one in the queue. It's one of the bills that's in the queue.
Okay, we'll take an online question. Inside Alaska Politics, Michelle Scannell, are you available? And do you have a question for us?
Hi, everyone. No, I don't have any questions, but thank you.
All right, any further questions out there? Yes.
Yeah, Geran, KTO on 360 North. I guess to follow up on Rhonda's question, who's to blame if Aaron's Law doesn't pass this year?
You know, I would take some of the responsibility. I remain committed to getting this bill passed. I'm going to do everything in my power to get the bill passed, make it the policy of the state of Alaska. I know I have a lot of colleagues who join me in that effort, and you know, as time goes on, it'll be more and more clear who the few people maybe are that don't support the effort, and those individuals need to hear from Alaskans and make it known that it's a high priority for passing this year.
Any other further questions? Well, one final one.
Rhonda McBride, KTVA. I know that you're trying to maintain, not burn any bridges here, but I mean, I think the public has a right to know why this bill isn't going anywhere in the House. Is it politics?
I don't disagree with that statement. I just don't feel comfortable speaking on someone else's behalf. I don't have information that I can share on that matter.
Are you
I can
frustrated?
tell you, I am frustrated. I was ready to pass the bill the first day of session. We haven't stopped working on it. We announced on November 17th I'd be pre-filing the bill, you know, in the hopes that that would continue the momentum and we'd see early passage. We've worked with the third floor, and the governor called for it in the state of the state. So we're doing everything we can. I am frustrated. I think there's a lot of frustration. And the public, I heard that from Fairbanks when it didn't pass last year. They've since moved forward voluntarily in a policy in their area. I don't want these things like domestic violence, sexual assault, and child sexual abuse to be the things that distinguish Alaska from other states. And that's where we stand today. I am going to do everything I can to change that. I know there are other members of the legislature that feel the same. And, you know, we need help in putting pressure on the people who aren't moving quickly.
You know, one thing I would add to that is I've been taught, because it's sort of the decorum of this building, and I respect that, not to question motivations. Now, we all have at least an ounce of cynicism, and we're all capable of that. But I think, Rhonda, the best source for that answer is to go to the chairman of the committee.
Which committee is that?
House Education.
Because I know, you know, Representative Tarr is being generous when she says, or humble when she says she would blame herself. I know how hard she's worked on this. And so the best source for the answer would be the chairman of the committee.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you next week.